She was never late, not once in 12 years. That's what they said later, when the questions swelled, and the silence was unbearable. At 8:30 every Tuesday morning, since 1991, Eleanor Campbell opened the doors to the Bozeman Public Library. Her keys jingled against the heavy oak door, her coffee still warm in the home-purchased travel mug. It was routine, regular, reliable. Until one cold February morning, when the library was dark, the doors were shut, and Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. The first to notice was Margaret Doyle, the children's librarian. She opened the door, as she did at 8:45, to get ready to sort book returns, but today something was not right. The windows were dark, the door wouldn't open, the air reeked with the Montana cold, and her breath twisted up into tiny clouds as she stood there, stunned. She tried to call Eleanor's house. Nothing. She called again. Still nothing. At 9:15, she couldn't bear it anymore and called the police. Deputy Frank Thompson arrived at Eleanor's small blue house on Elm Street at a little after 10. It was the kind of house that seemed to have been on a postcard, neat and quiet with white shutters and a well-manicured lawn. The front door was locked. He pounded on it repeatedly, yelled her name, peered through the windows. Nothing. He walked around back, his boots crunching in the small snowfall, and found something that made his stomach twist into knots. The back door was open. Inside, all was fine. The kitchen was spotless. A long cup of coffee on the counter, hardened now, but half full. A pile of books lay open on the table, books that Eleanor had been tallying up for the library, her glasses, neatly set on top, her coat, hanging by the back door, her purse still lying open in the living room, filled with wallet and ID. Her car was parked in the driveway, its keys resting on the kitchen counter. But Eleanor herself was nowhere to be found. Thompson called for reinforcements. Before long, Sheriff Dale Morris arrived with 2 deputies. They went through the house from top to bottom, the attic, the cellar, every closet and room. Not a single thing disturbed. No struggle, no broken lock, no footprints in the snow. Her bed was neatly made. Her slippers were still by the door. It looked as though she had just gone out into the cold and vanished. By lunchtime, the word was circulating in Bozeman like wildfire. Eleanor Campbell, the lady who never missed a day, who organized the children's activities, who always had a smile and a welcome for every visitor, was dead. Volunteers began appearing at the sheriff's office, seeking to help. Margaret sat quietly in the corner, weeping over her hands, repeating that Eleanor never missed work, never. Meanwhile, Sheriff Morris stood in the kitchen, staring at that slightly ajar back door. Everyone had spoken of Eleanor as being cautious, precise, punctual. She always locked up. She always followed routine. So why was the door slightly ajar? Had she slipped out for some reason? Had someone been waiting in ambush for her? Or had she walked off with someone she knew and trusted? The questions tallied, but the answers would not appear. As night descended, search parties combed the grounds. Below 15 degrees, the temperature dropped, and the wind howled through the trees as volunteers shouted Eleanor's name into the darkness. Flashlights cut through the snow. Dogs yelped at the strange voices, and porch lights flickered on as neighbors came out to help. But no one found a single clue. It was as if the night swallowed her whole. Inside, Margaret insisted on walking over Christmas Day again. The sheriff obliged. She tiptoed, not daring to touch anything, examining all with the analytical eye of a librarian. The coffee cup, the glasses, the coat, all just so. She pushed open the closet door. All the clothes were still there. Even Eleanor's snow boots remained by the door, though she would have had to go out in them in such a storm. Nothing lacking, nothing out of place. All so delightfully normal, and that frightened her. By 8 at night, the police had set up the station as a command center. Detective Linda Hayes was given the case and began questioning anyone who had seen Eleanor in the days preceding her vanishing. The story each time was the same. She had worked her entire shift Monday, spoken with customers, helped students, run bills for returns. She had been normal, friendly, calm, maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual. The final person to see anything of her was her neighbor, Robert Wilson, 3 houses down from her. He had taken out his garbage at approximately 7:30 Monday evening, and noticed that her kitchen lights were still on. He did not see her, but the soft glow in the window and the blue flash of her television told him that she was at home. After that, no one heard or saw anything of her again. Somewhere between the still Monday night and Tuesday morning, Eleanor Campbell was gone. Detective Hayes studied the evidence over and over again, but the facts never changed. The back door had been opened, no fingerprints but Eleanor's. No sign of struggle, no sign of forced opening. Either someone had been extremely careful, or Eleanor had opened that door by herself, and if she did, was there someone out waiting for her? 12 years never having taken a day off. One morning, poof, disappeared into thin air. What really happened to Eleanor Campbell? And why does her peaceful little house on Elm Street still appear as though it's holding a secret? The coffee on the counter presented another enigma. It remained in the pot, as though Eleanor had brewed it, but never made a cup. The timer on the coffee pot revealed that it had been set to switch on at 5:45 that morning. Everyone who knew her swore that Eleanor was an early riser. She liked sitting in silence over coffee and a book before getting ready for work. But if the coffee had been made at 5:45, and now it was cold and unused, what happened in those lost hours between morning and 8:30? Did someone knock on the door? Did she receive a phone call that interrupted her? Detective Hayes examined the phone records immediately. Nothing after 9 the previous night. No calls received or made, except one at 8:15 p.m. when Eleanor had called the library to order a book from a supplier. Then, nothing. As midnight approached, the temperature had risen to 8 degrees. Sheriff Morris finally called off the ground search until morning, but he had deputies stationed in the area overnight. Volunteers went home exhausted and stunned, not knowing what to believe. Margaret Doyle refused to leave the station. She sat in the waiting room swaddled in a blanket, eyes vacant, replaying the day over and over in her mind. At about midnight, Eleanor's younger sister, Patricia Campbell, arrived from Helena. Her face was tear-streaked and white. Detective Hayes questioned her for nearly an hour, asking her gently about Eleanor's routine, her contacts, her mood. But Patricia could not provide any answers, only bewilderment. She just kept repeating that Eleanor was fine, steady, predictable, happy with what she had. She would never just vanish. She'd been taken by someone. Or maybe, in some way, she disappeared from her life into the shadows of her own volition. In those first 12 hours, while the town had looked and prayed, her assailant had gained an impossible head start. The trail was growing cold. The first real lead came from a most unlikely source. 3 days later, a fast-stop convenience store clerk on Main Street phoned in a tip. He was a 22-year-old named Carl Anderson, working the late shift to pay for community college tuition. Surfing through available security video for inventory, he noticed something unusual. At exactly 4:37 a.m. day, the morning Eleanor disappeared, a black sedan crept into view of the camera and moved east down Main Street. The car slowed just beyond the intersection with Elm Street, where Eleanor lived, before rolling out of shot. Detective Hayes reached the gas station within 20 minutes. She was standing with Kyle at the counter, watching the fuzzy black and white video in a never-ending loop. The image was blurred, the lighting poor. The car could have been a Buick from the late 90s, maybe an Oldsmobile dark blue or black shade, can't say for certain. The license plate on the car was not visible. The driver was a mere silhouette behind the wheel. But it was timing that mattered. 4:37 a.m. hours before Eleanor would be opening the library. A suspicious car creeping by her street at that exact time. Hayes got the tape copied and to the station. She sent crews by every house and business within a 3-block radius of Elm and Main, and asked if anyone recognized the car. The response was enormous but disorganized. Bozeman was a small town, and at least a dozen of its residents owned black sedans that year. None of them could recall where they were at 4:37 that night. Most were asleep. A few had already left for work early. The first tip looked solid but soon dissolved into a waste of false leads. Then came the second tip, which was just as weak. One individual who did come forward was a lady by the name of Helen Stewart, who volunteered at the library every Thursday afternoon. She said she had heard Eleanor talking to some man at the front desk on the day she had disappeared. The conversation had been tense, but low. Helen had only caught a few words, something about requiring a bit more time, something about not being ready to make any decisions. The man's voice was low, on the verge of begging, but she just couldn't quite make out the words. Hayes interrogated Helen repeatedly, trying to extract every detail from memory. The man, according to Helen, was medium build, around 5'10", 5'11", dark jacket, blue jeans, dark or perhaps brown hair. She'd seen no glimpse of his face. He had his back to her most of the time. The encounter had lasted only a few minutes when he left out the front door. Eleanor went back to her desk immediately, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said anything. Has checked the day's visitors. 37 people had borrowed titles, and maybe 20 came in to read or work on the computers. Every name sounded familiar: regulars, retirees, families, students, none remembered. She began calling and interviewing them one by one. Some had spotted Eleanor that day. Others had not. A few thought they had seen a man talking to her, but none could describe him. The discrepancies piled up. A postman claimed to have seen Eleanor strolling down Birch Street on that Monday afternoon, although her car had been left in the library all day, and she had no reason to be in that neighborhood. A teenager asserted he'd spotted her at the grocery store on Tuesday morning, although this was impossible. By then, she'd already vanished. Detective Hayes began to witness firsthand the untrustworthiness of human memory. People so longed to help that they were fabricating memories, confusing the days, telling themselves they saw her when they hadn't. Everyone in town was grasping at shreds of hope, as Sheriff Morris was running out of patience. They had a mysterious car but no identification, a conversation with an unknown man, a missing woman with no hint of struggle, no sign of violence, and no reason to vanish. The case was turning into a puzzle made up of pieces that don't fit. Volunteers still searched the woods, the river banks, the snowy fields that ring Bozeman. They were against nature. Twice snow had lain upon what might have been left behind when Eleanor disappeared. Patricia was on local television, her face pale and anxious, pleading for news. Her voice trembled as she spoke about her sister, gentle, calm, dependable, well-liked by everyone. She offered a $5,000 reward for anything that could possibly bring them back to her. The tip line was filled with calls, most of them useless, some real, but without clues. Days passed, leads vanished. And beneath the frozen quiet of Bozeman, the question left unspoken bore down harder than ever. What really happened to Eleanor Campbell during those dark hours before the morning? The coffee on the counter was an open-ended clue. It called in the pot, as though Eleanor had brewed it, but never touched it. The timer on the coffee maker showed it had been set for 5:45 a.m., a habit everyone knew she kept. She liked the quiet of early morning, sipping her coffee and reading before starting to work. But if she had started her day at 5:45 and by 8:30 was already out, what did she do with those intervening hours? Did someone ring her doorbell? Did she go out somewhere for some reason? Or had she merely vanished between one beat of the heart and the next? Detective Hayes searched through her phone records, but discovered nothing unusual. No one made a call after 9 last night, and the previous call was to the library at 8:15 p.m., when Eleanor had completed a book reservation, and nothing more. At midnight, temperatures dropped to 8 degrees. Sheriff Morris also brought the evening's search to a close, but patrol cars continued to cruise the edges. Volunteers trudged home tired, chilled by loss and cold. Margaret Doyle refused to go home. She sat in the police station, covered with a blanket over her shoulders, staring at the wall, lost in thought. Around 1 in the morning, Eleanor's younger sister, Patricia Campbell, came in from Helena. Her face was pale, tear-stained. Detective Hayes spoke with her for nearly an hour, asking her about Eleanor's daily routine, moods, interactions. Patricia shook her head again and again. Eleanor was happy, she insisted, grounded. She would never just walk away. Someone must have done something with her, or led her willingly into the darkness. Those first 12 hours were crucial, but by morning, whoever had taken Eleanor had already established a lead no one could catch up on. 3 days passed before a small lead cropped up from an unlikely source. Carl Anderson, a 22-year-old cashier at the Fast Stop convenience store, called the police tip line. Sought through security footage at the Main Street Fast Stop. He noticed something out of place. At exactly 4:37 a.m. Tuesday morning, a black sedan crept slowly through the picture, eastbound on Elm Street, the same street Eleanor lived on. The car stopped at the intersection before vanishing. Detective Hayes ran to the gas station and watched alongside Kyle at the counter, watching the grainy footage play back endlessly. The image was black and white, barely legible. The vehicle was a late '90s South Oldsmobile or Buick, dark blue or black. No plate number could be discerned, and the driver was a silhouette behind the wheel. But the timing was uncanny. Only hours before Eleanor was to open the library, Hayes copied the video and sent officers house to house, canvassing each of the homes and businesses within a 3-block radius of that corner. Dozens of the residents owned similar vehicles. Most were in bed at the time. Some were already on early shift at the mill or hospital. The lead evaporated like water on hot sand, promising at first, then gone without warning. Another lead came days later. One of the library volunteers, Helen Stewart, spoke up with something she'd been too afraid to say. On Monday afternoon, a day before Eleanor went missing, she'd overheard Eleanor conversing with a man at the front desk. It had been a tense, but hushed conversation. Helen remembered Eleanor mentioning needing more time, not being ready to decide. The man's voice was low and urgent, bordering on a plea, although Helen could not discern the words. When asked to provide a description of him, Helen could only recall generalities: medium build, maybe 5'10" or 5'11", dark shirt, blue jeans, maybe brown hair. His back was to her most of the time, and she hadn't really seen his face. The exchange took only a few minutes before the man left. Eleanor had simply gotten back to work, calm and unreadable. Detective Hayes removed the visitor logs for the day. 37 people checked out books. Another 20 stopped by to browse or work at the computers. All familiar faces. Nothing unusual. She interviewed each one of them individually. Some had glimpsed Eleanor, some hadn't. No one saw a man matching the description. Misinformation grew as false sightings began pouring in. One of the postal carriers vowed he had seen Eleanor on Birch Street Monday afternoon, despite her car having sat outside the library all day long. One of the teens was adamant that he had spotted her at the neighborhood grocery store Tuesday morning, the day she went missing. None of it made any sense. Hayes understood that people's memories had already begun to bend from stress. Everyone wanted to help, but truth and rumor had already begun to merge. Weeks passed. The black sedan remained unidentified. The library man a ghost. The case was crumbling into pieces that refused to fit together. By the end of March, the case had nearly come to a halt. Detective Hayes had interviewed more than 80 people, pursued dozens of dead-end leads, and reviewed hundreds of hours of surveillance tapes. Nothing worked out. The case was withering away. On March 28th, 6 weeks into Eleanor's disappearance, Sheriff Morris held a press conference at the courthouse. He stood between Detective Hayes and Patricia Campbell, facing a room filled with reporters and anxious citizens. He chose his words carefully, being as truthful as possible without creating false expectations. The investigation was ongoing, he explained, but without new evidence or witnesses, the case risked getting cold. He urged anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. Patricia sat beside him, pale and tired out. She had given up her job as a school administrator and had moved into Eleanor's home, unable to let it go. She walked every day through the rooms, touching Eleanor's books, clothes, coffee mug, searching for a hint that was not there. It all about her sister's existence felt so plain, so unbearably unremarkable. No hidden diaries, no secret letters, no signs of tension. Just neat stacks of books and the serene tidiness of a woman who had lived alone for much too long. The town's grief had been quick and fierce, but as weeks turned into months, the fervor faded. Volunteers returned to their routines, flyers yellowed on notice boards. The library hired a temporary replacement for Eleanor's day. And slowly, life crept back into motion, while Eleanor remained in limbo time, suspended between life and death. Detective Hayes would not let it rest. Even when off duty, she read the reports, re-questioned the witnesses, and charted out every minute of Eleanor's last 10 hours. She obsessed over the timeline. Eleanor visited the library at 6. There were lights on at 7:30, according to the neighbor. The coffee maker was programmed for 5:45 a.m. somewhere in that 10-hour window. Something had happened. Someone had stopped by her house, called her outside, or talked her into going out. Hayes began wondering if the disappearance was not an accident. Maybe someone knew her habits, knew when she'd be alone in her house. She cross-referenced the library's records of everyone who borrowed books in the months before Eleanor disappeared, running names through criminal databases. Nothing. She checked her church group, her book club, the neighbors. They all had nice things to say. No one had any enemies. Eleanor Campbell's existence was so blameless that it approached being inexcusable. Spring came to Montana, melting the snow and revealing what had been hidden all winter. Search parties went out again, combing through melting forests and riverbanks. They found nothing, no clothes, no personal items, no body. She was gone, apparently, by May. The police officially declared the case cold. Active investigation was suspended, although Sheriff Morris promised it would never be closed. Patricia had a candlelight vigil in the library parking lot on the 3-month anniversary of Eleanor's disappearance. Over 200 people came, singing softly in the fading light, holding candles against the gusts. Margaret Doyle spoke for the library staff, her voice quivering as she described the emptiness Eleanor had left. But when the candles blew out, reality reasserted itself. Eleanor was gone, and nobody knew why. 15 years passed like a steady erosion of hope. Her name became a warning parents shared with children, a memory of closed doors and not trusting strangers. Patricia never lost heart. She kept her site on the internet, published pleas and memorials, arranged the annual vigils, even when a few came out of faithful hearts. Detective Hayes retired in 2012, but Eleanor's case stayed with her. The papers rested in a drawer in her home office, read and reread over and over, as though the answer would somehow magically reveal itself. Then, in spring 2018, she received a phone call that took her back in time. David Thompson, an old colleague from Eleanor's early work at the library, was on the other end. He told me he had moved to Oregon years ago and only recently heard about her missing persons case. He believed that he might have information, something he never realized could matter. They met on a drizzly April afternoon at a small downtown coffee shop. Thompson, who was in his late 50s, looked restless, gripping his cup tightly. He reported working from 1998 until 2004 at the library, overlapping with Eleanor for 6 years. They had been friendly, but not close. But during the late 2001 or early 2002 time, he began to sense a change in her. She had always been calm, disciplined, consistent. But the year before, something was different. She was preoccupied, restless. She started taking personal calls in the back room, and closing the door. Every now and then she left early, something she never did. When Thompson asked her, kindly, if everything was okay, she smiled and replied that it was just personal things, nothing to worry about. Then, on one summer evening in 2002, Thompson had been working late one evening during the summer of 2002, trying to get ahead on inventory before he left for home. Venturing out the back door around 8 o'clock, something caught his eye in the dark parking lot. Eleanor was by a dark sedan, definitely not her car. She wasn't accompanied by anyone. A man stood beside her, tall and sharply dressed, probably in his 40s. Their body language was close to be casual. They spoke quietly, with a tension that made Thompson hesitate before walking past. When Eleanor saw him staring, she stood up immediately. The conversation cut off in mid-sentence. She exchanged a quick, nervous goodbye with the man and sped off to her own car without further comment. Thompson did not give it much thought at the time. Eleanor was private, and whatever was happening was none of his business. Still, something in the look she gave him, something in that moment of awkwardness laid in his mind a long time afterward. A few months went by, and the bizarre behavior ceased. The late nights, the phone calls in private, the half-second glances away, they all disappeared. Eleanor fell back into her calm, predictable routine, as if whatever had been occurring had just evaporated. As David Thompson told all this to retired Detective Hayes, she leaned forward, her expression tightening. No one, in 15 years of unearthing, had ever suggested that Eleanor was involved with anyone romantically. She'd always been the alone, dedicated, self-supported one. The thought that she might have had a secret affair rattled everything. Hayes pressed more from him. Could he remember anything else about the man? Thompson closed his eyes, burrowing into ancient, faded memories. The man had been maybe 6 feet tall, dark hair just beginning to show traces of grey, smooth-shaven face. Slacks and button-down shirt, professional, on top of things. The car, dark blue, or maybe black, some sort of sedan. The make and model were lost. So 16 years had passed, and he'd only caught sight of it for a moment in the fading light. Then there was the question Hayes had to ask, why hadn't he done something sooner? Thompson appeared genuinely pained. He explained that in February 2003, when Eleanor disappeared, he was busy with his own family crisis. His wife had just learned that she had cancer, and they were on the verge of moving to Oregon, so she could be treated. He'd made a brief statement to the police, then confirmed Eleanor's work schedule, her reliability, but no one asked about her home life, and he hadn't connected that odd intersection in the parking lot with her disappearance. It had been irrelevant, he'd thought, then. Now, having read old newspaper articles and realizing how little anyone had known about her home life, he at last saw how much it might matter. Hayes thanked him quietly. For the first time in over a decade, the case had something concrete. If Eleanor had been dating someone, specifically someone who was forced to keep it a secret, there was finally motive to investigate. The only question left was whether or not there was still sufficient evidence to discover who that man was, and how much of a role he might have had in Eleanor Campbell's fate. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Department reopened the case and gave it to Detective Marcus Riley. He was renowned for cracking cold cases, with fanatical attention to detail, a low-key, meticulous detective in his early 40s who liked paper trails better than hunches. Like all the others in Montana law enforcement, he was familiar with the name Eleanor Campbell. But now, with a lead that never had been followed, he felt he could go back to the case with open eyes and the advantage of more advanced forensic technology unavailable in 2003. Riley started by pulling every scrap of paperwork, interview transcripts, evidence logs, witness statements, forensic reports. For 2 weeks consecutively, he read hundreds of pages, sketching out the timeline and double-checking information that had previously been labeled as dead ends. What hit him first was the complete absence of anything that could be described as a personal life. Eleanor had been described by all as kind, reserved, and entirely devoted to her work. No one had mentioned dating. No one had mentioned a secret companion. Or else everybody had been wrong and Eleanor had done her best to hide that part of herself. Riley started re-questioning individuals within Eleanor's circle, now asking tougher, more probing questions. Had she ever said she saw anyone? Had her routine varied? Had she appeared distracted, worried, or overly secretive in the year leading up to her disappearance? The majority of them shook their heads, providing the same soft accounts of the reserved librarian they had known. And then, same librarian who'd first reported Eleanor missing, Margaret Doyle, remembered something small, something she'd never have thought significant. Way back in late 2002, she'd occasionally catch Eleanor smiling at her phone, when she was certain she wasn't being watched. She'd slipped in once or twice to make a quick call in a hushed voice in the back office. When Margaret had teasingly asked her if she were talking to a secret admirer, Eleanor had blushed, smiled awkwardly, and changed the subject. It was nothing. Margaret had then thought a gust of wind that vanished. But now that she reflected on it, it was as if another fragment of a jigsaw that had been misplaced. Riley studied her phone records again. In 2003, cell phones were a new thing, and Eleanor's records hadn't been looked over with much brains at the time of the first investigation. Her phone records showed the usual numbers: her sister, her co-workers, her book club members, but one pattern was glaring. From March until October of 2002, there were dozens of short calls, each not more than a few minutes in length, to the same number. Then, abruptly, they stopped. No other calls after October, just nothing. After the number, Riley was taken to a surprise. It was from a business phone at Hoffman and Associates, a small accounting firm that had existed in Bozeman for many years. When he requested employee records for that year, 3 names surfaced. One of the men had died in 2007. Another had relocated to Seattle years before. But the third, Kenneth Hoffman, was alive and kicking right there in Bozeman. Hoffman was 58 now, married more than 30 years to Barbara. 2 grown children who'd been long absent. No criminal record, no violent record, nothing out of place on paper. A good accountant, a member of the Rotary Club, and by all outside scrutiny, an ordinary man. But Riley had seen it too many times before. Normal didn't always mean innocent. Kenneth Hoffman was well known to the good people of Bozeman. He worked for Habitat for Humanity, for goodness sake, paid his taxes in a timely manner, and had even served as treasurer to a local charity. By all outward measures, he was the kind of fellow no one suspected. His name had never, ever been mentioned in the original investigation into Eleanor Campbell's disappearance, however. Not until Detective Marcus Riley found those phone records 6 months of non-stop contact between them in 2002. And then, nothing. Riley did not rush. He began by retracing Hoffman's tracks from the winter of 2003. Hoffman had been interviewed briefly, then nothing more than routine questioning. He told detectives he'd attended an accounting conference in Billings that week Eleanor vanished. He even provided receipts and registration documents as proof. It had been enough to establish his innocence then. There'd been no grounds to delve further. But Riley wasn't satisfied with surface information. The dates of the conference had been the 16th through 18th of February. Eleanor disappeared during the early morning of the 18th. Hoffman's hotel bill registered payments up to Monday night, the 17th, but nothing thereafter. There was no indication that he was in Billings the following morning. Where had he been? Then, Riley dug further. He requested past toll and travel records from the Montana Department of Transportation. Records that hadn't been used in years. Weeks went by before results were in, and when they were, Riley's heart beat a little faster. A vehicle registered to Kenneth Hoffman had passed through the toll plaza, just south of Bozeman, at 11:47 p.m. on February 17th. Hoffman had been at the conference, and then driven home, before Eleanor disappeared. He had been dishonest or, at least, left out an important piece of information in his tale. 15 years later, Riley finally had a suspect to pursue. He didn't pursue Hoffman right away. Instead, he built a wall of information first: every record, every transaction, every sheet of paper that could reveal the man behind the legend. He pored over Hoffman's credit card statements, his history of travel, his work schedule, even parking tickets. Undercover, he interviewed former co-workers, asking seemingly benign questions about Hoffman's routine, his temperament, his habit. Nobody guessed the true purpose for the renewed interest. Riley waited patiently, on purpose, for the right moment to move. Alongside, he reviewed the physical evidence that had been collected from Eleanor's home. Back in 2003, forensic science had been crude by comparison. Partial prints and fibers had then been set aside as inconclusive. Now, with advanced analysis, they had another opportunity to speak. Riley had the old samples resubmitted. Weeks passed before the results came through. Among the unidentified fingerprints collected on Eleanor's back porch was a partial match to Kenneth Hoffman created directly from his professional licensure record. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was proof that Hoffman had visited Eleanor's house, something he'd never once admitted. On September 14, 2018, Riley knew it was time. Hoffman was called in on what was offered as a routine follow-up interview, one of the department's fresh initiative to crack old cold cases. He came voluntarily, neatly dressed in khakis and a crisply ironed polo, every inch the upright citizen. Standing behind the one-way glass, Riley watched him enter the chair, calm and unruffled, hands steepled together, face open. He looked like a man with nothing to hide. Riley arrived and started slowly, asking Hoffman what he could recall about Eleanor Campbell. Hoffman answered in a gentle manner, his voice restrained. She'd been a nice woman, he told her, helpful, capable. He'd make trips into the library every so often to study tax legislation and rules of business. Her disappearance, he claimed, had been a blow that shocked the whole town. Riley nodded, taking notes, enabling the interview to proceed smoothly. Then he asked about the phone records. Why were Hoffman and Eleanor in such frequent contact in 2002? For a moment, Hoffman's mask faltered. A brief flicker crossed his face before he composed himself. He explained the calls, a strictly business standard discussion about reference materials and financial reports. When Riley told him that the calls stopped abruptly in October, Hoffman shrugged once more. The project had been finished, he explained. There had been no need to talk again. Riley allowed the tension to build. Hoffman's fingers clicked against the table once before he froze them, catching on the tell. And then Riley shifted gears. He talked of the Billings conference, the clean little alibi that had stood up for 15 years. Hoffman recited the same particulars he'd provided back in 2003. The workshops, the hotel, the co-workers he'd conferred with. He was smooth, practiced. That's when Riley pushed the toll record onto the table. The receipt showed Hoffman's vehicle driving through Bozeman sometime around midnight on February 17th. The query was simple. Why had he left early from Billings, and why hadn't he mentioned it? For the first time, Hoffman's calm was shattered. He went white, his lips compressing in a thin line as he gazed at the proof. And then he spoke slowly, carefully choosing each word. He hadn't been well, he explained. His stomach had been bothering him. He'd planned on driving home, sleeping, and being back the next morning. It hadn't seemed so important to say then. He'd arrived home around 1:30 a.m., gone straight to bed, and never talked with Eleanor that night. Riley asked if someone could verify that. Hoffman paused, then admitted his wife was sleeping when he came home. No witnesses, no proof. Then the question that would turn everything around. Why was there a fingerprint from Kenneth Hoffman on Eleanor's back door? The room was still. Hoffman's jaw tightened. His fists curled up, then relaxed. Then finally, he spoke quietly that it was a mistake. He had never gone to Eleanor's home. He could not explain it. Riley's tone stayed steady, measured. He constructed the question clearly: had Hoffman been having an affair with Eleanor Campbell? Hoffman's chair creaked as he leapt to his feet, his face flushing. He denied it hotly, shouting, Eleanor was a friend, nothing more. To intimate otherwise was offensive to her, to his wife, to his good name. But even as he kept talking, Riley could see the trembling hands, the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the furtive glances at the door. The cracks were opening, the reassuring veneer was cracking, and it was there, in that small, windowless room, where 15 years' worth of secrets were finally emerging. Detective Marcus Riley moved forward, his voice steady but firm. He was offering Kenneth Hoffman one final opportunity to tell the truth, to tell what really happened that night. For what seemed like a long time, Hoffman said nothing. Then slowly he shifted back in his chair. The hue had drained from his cheeks. His lips parted, but all that could make was a straining whisper. He would have a lawyer. The interview was over, but it didn't matter to Riley. He had heard enough. The mask was slipping, and it was only a matter of time before the truth finally spilled out. In hours, Kenneth Hoffman's attorney appeared, a hard-eyed, calculating woman named Carol Bennett, known in Bozeman court circles for defending high-placed men charged with atrocious crimes. She wasted no time, walking into the sheriff's office with cool control and shutting down any further questioning. Riley expected it. Riley expected what came next. Less than 2 days after that, Bennett called the district attorney's office. Her client would speak. She informed them, but on specific terms. No surprises, no traps, full cooperation. They demanded leniency in sentencing. The negotiations went on for 3 excruciating days. And then, on the 20th of September, 2018, Kenneth Hoffman sat across from Detective Riley once more. But this time, there was someone sitting beside him, his lawyer. His hands were slightly shaking. He knew he was not going anywhere. And then he collapsed. What spilled out over the next hours was a story of fixation, desperation, and choices that could never be undone. By Hoffman's own testimony, it had started innocently enough. He'd met Eleanor Campbell at the library, just as he'd always claimed. But professional contact soon turned intimate. By spring 2002, the two were involved in a secret affair, one that consumed them both. Eleanor, he insisted, was lonely, alone, tired of living in obscurity. He was trapped in a withering marriage, starving for something to feel alive again. Their meetings became a common practice, secretive as a motley motel on the outskirts of town. Even sometimes in Eleanor's house, when she had the place to herself. The affair was fragile, based on fear and guilt. Hoffman was always in fear of being caught, that his reputation would be tarnished, that everything he had built would be taken down. By October, Eleanor had reached her limit. She told him she couldn't do it anymore. The lies, the sneaking around suffocating her. She wanted honesty, a clean slate, even if that meant ending it for good. Hoffman begged her not to go, but Eleanor stood firm. Their last call was frantic. After that, silence. Hoffman explained that he tried to move on. He went back to his wife, his job, his routine. But he couldn't let her go. He'd drive by her house, watch her from a distance, telling himself that, if only he could speak with her one more time, she'd forgive him and welcome him back. And then there was the night of February 17, 2003. Hoffman was supposed to be in Billings for his accounting conference, but, instead, drove the long distance back to Bozeman in his vehicle. He convinced himself but it was nothing, just that he needed to see if Eleanor was okay. It was later than midnight when he arrived at our house. The porch light was not illuminated. He went to the back door and knocked. Eleanor opened the door in her bathrobe, surprised and furious to see him standing on the doorstep. She told him to leave. It was over. She did not wish for him there. They yelled at one another in the cold evening air, words building. Hoffman begged, pleaded, told her he loved her, that he would leave his wife, start over, do anything. But Eleanor stood firm. She told him she'd moved on, but she didn't want him around anymore. And that's when something inside Kenneth Hoffman broke. He could not put it afterwards into words, only that the refusal was final, unbearable. He strode ahead of her to the kitchen as she screamed for him to go away. When she grabbed the phone to call the police, he lost control. He grasped at her arm, attempted to hold her back, to listen, to be reasonable. But the struggle spiraled out of control. In madness, he had his fingers locked around her neck, pleading, shaking, attempting to smother her. When he finally let her go, Eleanor was no longer moving. Hoffman said he remained there 4 hours, numb from what he'd done, and unable to make sense of it. Panic followed. He covered the body with one of the blankets from her bedroom, removed her from the house, and drove. He knew where to head. His family owned an old ranch, some 40 miles northwest of Bozeman, neglected, abandoned, surrounded by acres of lonely land. The perfect place to fade away. He drove there in the cold night under the freezing darkness, his headlights the only light 4 miles. He dug a shallow grave in the frozen earth, behind a row of pine trees at the far northern edge of the property. It was hours' work. When he'd done, he'd put Eleanor there beneath the pines. He drove back home at dawn. He threw the blankets and his clothes away on a restaurant dumpster on the town's outskirts. When he finally went to bed, his wife briefly stirred, half asleep, and asked whether the conference had ended prematurely. He said he felt unwell. She rolled over and went back to sleep. And Kenneth Hoffman never spoke of his secret again for 15 years. He attended Eleanor's vigils. He donated to the search fund. He watched her family mourn, hugged them, told them he hoped she was found. All the while, he was aware of exactly where she was. When Riley brought up the subject of Kenneth's brother, Martin, the story became darker. A couple of days afterward, Martin went to the ranch to check the fences and discovered the area disturbed. Kenneth wept and told him everything, begging him not to say anything. Out of loyalty or fear, Martin did as he was asked. Together, they camouflaged the grave in a more subtle way, adding rocks and twigs to create a natural look. Kenneth's wife, Barbara Hoffman, had never been told the truth. But Riley guessed she'd picked up on more than she admitted. She spotted the mud on Kenneth's boots, the scratches on his hands, the morning after the murder. When she accused him of it, he said he'd slipped on ice in front of his hotel. She'd believed him or pretended to. 2 days later, the case reached its last chapter. On the 22nd of September 2018, Detective Riley's forensic recovery team headed out to the Hoffman family ranch, which was just as Kenneth had described it: remote, wind-blown, eaten by time. The principal house was crumbling in on itself, windows shattered, barn tilting drunkenly to one side. Wild grass had taken over the fields, the only sounds the wind through the pines. Riley and the group took Kenneth's map through the underbrush to the northern row of trees, 30 yards off a tall pine, half buried behind rocks and bushes. The disturbed ground still told. Even 10.5 years later, the earth remembered. From the moment the earth was first disturbed, the air over the old Hoffman ranchland felt heavy. The forensic team came in quiet. The only noise is the low hum of machines and the deliberate scratch of shovels through hard, cold-packed ground. Detective Riley hung back, his breath white in the chill, watching as layer after layer of earth was slowly unwrapped. The excavation took 6 boring hours. At every couple of inches, the technicians paused to fire, take measurements, and mark their progress. And then, when they had dug about 4 feet deep, The lead technician stopped. Below the ground, the shape of fabric had appeared a frayed, soiled blanket. They worked more tenderly now, shovels replaced by brushes. Piece by piece, the truth was unearthed. Inside the decayed fabric were the remains of Ms. D'Alessio, as Kenneth Hoffman had claimed. The forensic anthropologist present assured everyone what they had all suspected for so long: the bones belonged to a woman, probably in her mid-30s. Dental records would later make it official. After a 15-year search of questions unanswered and candlelit vigils, Eleanor Campbell had finally been located. Detective Riley phoned her directly. Patricia Campbell picked up at home in Helena. Her voice trembling, she delivered the news to her in a soft tone. She didn't say anything at all, just a lengthy period of silence. And then crying. All those years of anguish loosed at one time. When she finally did say something, it was only one word. Did she suffer? Riley told her truthfully, as gently as he could. The medical examiner believed that the cause of death had been strangulation. It hadn't been instantaneous, but Eleanor would have been unconscious in minutes. It was small comfort, but Patricia clung to it. At least now she could bring her sister home. At least the waiting was over. Soon after, Kenneth Hoffman was formally charged with second-degree murder. The prosecutors had wanted to charge him with first degree, citing the intentional drive back to Bozeman that night as an indication of intent. But the defense argued it had been a crime of passion, an impulsive act of violence. Hoffman's admission and cooperation in aiding the discovery of the body contributed positively to his case. Though his plea for mercy angered resentment throughout the community, he was denied bail. The man once celebrated for his civic activism and philanthropy, the same man who'd marched in line with Eleanor's family at vigils, now was called a monster. Bozeman reeled from shared shock. The betrayal hurt. And then there was the second arrest. On September 25th, the deputies visited the home of Martin Hoffman, Kenneth's small brother. He was quiet, obedient, and submissive, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Martin confessed easily, saying he had helped keep Eleanor's grave a secret all those years. He said he had done it out of loyalty, because he was afraid, weak. He had regretted it every day since, but never enough to confess. He was charged with accessory for the fact and obstruction of justice. But the news came 3 days later. September 28th, Barbara Hoffman, Kenneth's wife of more than 30 years, was arrested. The charge, obstruction of justice, and providing false information to police. The incriminating evidence was subtle but telling. Investigators discovered that Barbara had made a phone call to Kenneth's cellular phone on 1 a.m. in the late evening of the killing. Only a short time after his car had been filmed traveling through the toll booth, Bozeman. Confronted with her deception, Barbara lied. She agreed that she'd been awake when Kenneth had come home. She'd noticed the mud on his boots, the scratches on his hands. Asked where he'd been, he'd claimed to have hit a deer and driven off the road. She'd believed him, she said, but prosecutors disagreed. They testified that Barbara had known or, at least suspected the truth all along, and had determined to cover for her husband, instead of the woman he had killed. Barbara's attorney had a hard time making her another victim bribed, lied to, torn between conscience and duty. In the court of public opinion, however, the verdict was in. Bozeman's citizens did not see her as a victim, but as the person who might have put an end to 15 years of suffering with one phone call. The Hoffman name, which had been a symbol of community pride, was now a synonym for deception and darkness. When the trials began, the full extent of what had been hidden for over a decade and a half came to light. Kenneth Hoffman's was the first. In April of 2019, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, avoiding a full trial. The courtroom was packed that day. The news reporters filled the benches. Eleanor's friends and family members sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces pinched but resolute. Patricia Campbell took up a front row seat with a handkerchief clutched tightly in both of her hands. When Kenneth Hoffman stood before the judge, he looked smaller than ever, slouched shoulders, sunken eyes. His attorney implored mercy on the basis of cooperation, remorse, and a previously clean record. But when the victim impact statements began, any sympathy that remained evaporated. Patricia spoke first. Her voice cracked as she described 15 years of not knowing, hope giving way to despair. She talked of birthdays remembered, and letters never written, and the haunting stillness of ignorance. And Margaret Doyle, the librarian who had first reported Eleanor missing, stood up and spoke to the town's grief, the fear that had lingered over Bozeman since that morning in February. One after another, voices filled the courtroom, completing the picture of a woman who was loved, admired, and robbed too young. When the judge finally spoke to the court, his voice was harsh and absolute. Kenneth Hoffman received life in prison without hope of parole. The courtroom was full of muted applause, interrupted by the bailiff's swift shout of order. Justice had taken 15 years, but it had come at last. Martin Hoffman's trial followed the next summer. He pleaded guilty to helping cover up. His lawyer said he acted in misguided loyalty. But the court saw a man who had chosen silence over truth. Martin got 5 years in state prison, with 3 years before parole eligibility. His wife divorced him 2 weeks after that. Barbara Hoffman's trial was last and divided the town. Her trial began in August 2019. The prosecution contended her 1 a.m. telephone call, her conflicted testimony, and the eyewitnesses that described her strange behavior after Eleanor vanished. The defense argued she had been duped, that she merely assumed her husband. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury found Barbara guilty of obstruction of justice, but acquitted her of making false statements. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison. In October 2019, 16 years after her disappearance, Eleanor Campbell was finally laid to rest. The funeral was private, quiet, and beautiful. Her grave sat beneath a tall pine tree, overlooking the valley outside Bozeman. Her headstone read, Eleanor Campbell, dear sister, friend, keeper of stories. The yearly vigil, which had been a February tradition for 15 years, was retired the next fall. In I.